thumbs up. So, you ready? Okay. All right, we will go ahead and get started as close to on time as possible. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us on this lovely Sunday afternoon in New York City. My name is Jackson Vaught, member of the class of 2016, and I am the New York chapter president of the Vanderbilt University Alumni Association. I'd like to welcome our area alumni, parents, family, and friends of the university we all know and love. Today is an extremely special day for a number of reasons, not least of which is that, and I think I am correct in saying this, we have the privilege here of hosting the first live in-person Commodore Classroom since the pandemic, so over 3 years. So. Putting it on an event like this takes a village, and I'd like to acknowledge a few of them right now. I'm joined today by another member of our board, our Vice President, Margaret Phillips, who really is the brains behind this whole operation and keeps me on track. Speaking of boards, we're also joined by a special guest today, Dan Lovinger and his family. Dan is a former member of the Vanderbilt Board of Trust and is a former president of the Alumni Relations Board. And a special shout out to his son, Nick, who I had the privilege of working with as co-president of this group for several years. I'd also like to thank the Vanderbilt Alumni Relations staff members attending here from Nashville. We have a few: Executive Director Caroline Johnson, Director Monique Smaby, and Associate Director Catherine Hooper. And I have to give a very special shout out to Catherine because it is due to her perseverance and longtime efforts that we are here today. We had started to plan this in April of 2020, if you can believe it. Needless to say, that did not happen. And we had to cancel. And Catherine, when we'd do our meetings, we'd say, we'll do it, we'll do it, we'll do it. Well, we did it, and very, very much thanks to her. There were probably even some of you today that registered for that ill-fated date, but thank you for your patience as well, 3.5 years later. We appreciate it. So, all right. Before I introduce our guest of honor, I did just want to give a brief plug about our next major event. April 27th is Vanderbilt's Giving Day, and we will be doing a live happy hour in the city as a celebration for donors. I will check at the door to make sure you gave, so no sneaking past me. But in all seriousness, we do hope that you'll make a donation of any size on Giving Day, because in 2022, we made a record or broke a record for the greatest number of donors ever to donate in a single day to the school. So the goal is to crack that again for 2023. You'll see more information about this and other amazing events we have planned this spring in the email newsletters. If you don't know what I'm talking about, come find me or Margaret afterwards, and we'll get you on the list. But I've talked enough, so let's get going. I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker, and he's literally distinguished. I looked it up in his title on the school's website, and it says distinguished. Distinguished Professor of History of Art, Leonard Folgarait, has been a part of the Vanderbilt community for most of his long and renowned career. He began teaching at VU in 1981 and has taught multiple generations of Vanderbilt graduates. His areas of specialization include modern Latin American, European, and American art and architecture, research, and teaching. His special interests are the relationship of art to politics, early Cubism, surrealism, performance art, film, photography, and historiography. I'm tired just reading that. So we are so thankful that he is here today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Folgarait.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Jackson, are you going to be sitting behind me the whole time?
Right. Yeah, that's weird. I'll go Much better.
I know you're my backup, but literally my backup. So I appreciate all of you so much for being here today, for that very kind introduction. And I want to say how very happy I am to be here today, happy in the truest sense of that word. Seeing so many familiar faces is truly both gratifying and rather overwhelming all at once. And perhaps during the lecture, I might show signs of my being overwhelmed. And like right now, I hope you understand that. I want to especially thank Catherine Hooper, back there, of the National Office, as well as Monique and Caroline, and Jackson here in New York, who his ego will improve because his first name will be mentioned quite often today. Special thanks go to Lennox, Reed, SK, Kiana, and Rick of the Met technical staff. They are so amazing. They're making all this possible. So I'm feeling very pampered by all this attention and somehow very much at home. So let's get started. Before I start, I want to draw your attention to the fact that certain images will have this asterisk at the end of the title. That means that those images are in the Met collection. So as you walk around, you might remember that you saw images here. And before I start, something happened before the lecture. Two members of that tech staff I was just thanking, Lennox and Kiana, who I don't see them right here. But they said, "Have you seen the red dot in this painting?" And I said, "What red dot?" And they say there's a red dot, if you see this in person, that is right here. You can see it in person. Don't look for it here. I've never seen that before. I don't know what that means. But I mentioned that because I always appreciate the input of students, and all of a sudden, Lennox and Kiana have become students of mine, and I want to give them an A for the day, just for that. We're all perpetual students, right? That's why you're all here. All right. Perhaps the most difficult job facing both the art lover and the art historian, the most daunting task of explanation and interpretation, is in front of abstract art, such as this painting by Jackson Pollack. I'm certain that all of you have had these questions occur to you at one point or another in front of this kind of painting. What does it look like? Why should I be looking at this? What does it mean? How did art ever get to this point? Why don't I know what to say or think about it? So these questions do add up, and more could be added to this list. But I'm not interested in the quantity of these questions, but rather in their quality. Notice that none of these questions are asked about representational, realistic painting, as this image, an art that seems to speak our language and that gives us an inroad to its possible meaning. We see in this art people who look like us. We are encouraged to merely walk forward through the picture plane into a world of familiar sights and sounds. Abstract painting of this sort blockades us against the illusioned physical entry of realism. It is not our world, is it? It has no resemblance to things, people, landscapes. We don't even know if the image is necessarily right side up. Left and right seem to be arbitrary directions. Whereas in realist painting, the eye and the mind can penetrate deeply into its world with the promise that the body will figuratively soon follow, abstract painting allows only the eye and the mind to enter, leaving the body permanently on this side of the canvas, cut off by the canvas itself as if it were a brightly colored roadblock. So the viewer becomes detached and disoriented and perhaps mesmerized by what is happening. No wonder the sorts of questions I listed above are usually unanswered in front of abstract art, whereas realist painting answers questions, or better yet, does not need for such questions to develop. The very point of abstract art is to ask unanswered and perhaps unanswerable questions. It is no wonder that this sort of painting causes a curious behavior on the part of museum goers. They walk quickly past it. It is no wonder that in art history lecture courses, there is a collective glazing of the eyes and defensiveness of mind when I say, and today the topic is abstract art. But all of this sounds so pessimistic, doesn't it? The implications so far are about an art that tells us nothing beyond its material conditions. It is flat and colored, that we have no resources with which to respond to it, that our relationship to it is one of muteness and deafness, or worse yet, that it is no relationship at all. But perhaps I have been providing a disservice to you and to this art, and perhaps contributing to the cliches about abstract art, all of the jokes about its lack of skill, lack of content. I have not, however, come all the way from Nashville simply to depress you, to leave you defeated in the face of this challenging art. I use the word challenging at this point because I want now to switch gears to suggest how we might acknowledge this challenge and live up to our responsibilities in the face of it. These terms, challenge and responsibilities, are usually not used in reference to looking at realistic art, such as this painting by Rockwell. Why? Because we have a passive relationship to realistic art. We are lulled into comfort by its familiar appearances, and in some cases, by its use of humor, as in this one. The viewer of abstract painting needs to be active rather than passive, engaged rather than inert, assertive rather than accepting. I am beginning to suggest why some viewers find this style of art so compelling, so powerful, and that is because its very challenge is a form of engagement with the viewer, insisting that one's opinion matters, that we can actively construct meaning, that we can walk away with it as our meaning, constructed by our needs, desires, and values. A Pollack painting can be our Pollack, fully as valuable as anyone else's, as valuable as that of the experts. Every one of us can be an expert in front of a Pollack. Just look at the many people who do not walk by quickly in front of these canvases. Look at the ones who pause, trapped by the magnetic visual pull of these swirls of color, and lose themselves for long periods of time, discovering things about the paintings and about themselves they never knew before. I'm also beginning to suggest the political effect that such an art can have on its viewers. Imagine 10 viewers in front of a realistic portrait of a woman smiling. Most of those 10 will walk away thinking that the woman is happy, that is the point of the painting. That is because the realistic image works as a strongly suggestive authority that we know how to respond to and mostly accept. On the contrary, these same 10 viewers can walk away from a Pollack painting and carry with them 10 strongly distinct interpretations, ranging from reading the image as happy or sad, shallow or profound, ironic or obvious. Such art creates, as it were, a politics of democracy in terms of interpretation, and breaks the authoritative and dominant power of realism to limit interpretation. This is a tremendously liberating effect for our art to empower its viewers with a new and intoxicating consciousness of free will. Before we get a deeper look at the paintings of Pollack, let us listen to the words of 2 other important American abstract painters of that time. In 1944, Robert Motherwell wrote that, quote, "As a result of the poverty of modern life, we are confronted with a circumstance that art is more interesting than life," end quote. Motherwell is writing at a time when it seemed that the Second World War, which the United States was fighting on 2 fronts, would never end, and that modern life, which was a life at war, was so impoverished culturally and spiritually that art could be, and perhaps should be, separated from it, to keep it interesting in the face of what he called, quote, "a period as demoralized as our own," end quote. In 1947, another American abstract painter, Barnett Newman, could say, quote, "It is only the pure idea that has meaning," end quote. By that he meant pure ideas in art, that purity possible only if the art were abstract. This was 2 years after the victory over Germany and Japan, a moment when we could expect jubilation in America at the termination of that violent conflict. Ironically, the Pacific War had ended with the first demonstration that nuclear power was, frighteningly, perhaps capable of destroying the entire planet, that anxieties over that Armageddon were polarizing the superpowers into the tension of the Cold War. And as the full scope of the Holocaust perpetrated by the Nazis in their push to eliminate an entire culture of people was first coming to light, enlightened citizens of the world realized how much of innocence and hope had vanished by the late 1940s. It is no wonder, then, that these two artists write and paint in terms that exclude the world from their art, to keep art pure, safe, away from poverty of spirit and demoralization, where only the pure, uncontaminated idea has any chance for any meaning. Barnett Newman, again in 1967, looking back to the late 40s, quote, "We felt the moral crisis of a world in shambles, devastated by a Great Depression and a fierce world war. And it was impossible at that time to paint the kind of painting that we had been doing, flowers and reclining nudes," end quote. So that is one quick, immediate reason for the high degree of abstraction in the work of these artists, the circle in which Pollack painted. The world, in effect, had been excluded from their canvases. We see only the pure expression of people who relating to their world as exiles from that world, not making meaning of that world, but making meaning in spite of that world. And if this seems a far-fetched theory that artists retreat into abstraction in the face of a violent and shattered world, then consider the work of perhaps the major European abstract painter of the 20th century. When did Piet Mondrian begin to compose these meticulous grid paintings of the search for perfect balance and peace? He started in the 1920s, in the wake of the First World War. Another reason for the abstraction of this American art has to do with the development of the styles that influenced it. When the flood of European artists fleeing the Second World War came to America, they came to New York City, and they brought with them two basic styles, one derived from Cubism and one from Surrealism. Both styles, of course, lead away from realism, from the objective imagery of the world and toward alternate descriptions, one using that rarefied language of geometry, as in this Cubist painting by Braque, and the other the images of dreams, as in this well-known image by Salvador Dali. Surely out of these two styles, mixed on foreign ground, no realistic art could emerge. These two styles were mixed in a very clear way by the American collector and art dealer Peggy Guggenheim, who in 1942 put on an exhibit in New York at her gallery called Art of This Century. The catalog for that exhibit included essays by André Breton, the leader of the Surrealists, and by Mondrian, the leader of the Cubist-derived abstract painters. And this is an image of some of these European artists in New York, and for the convenience of what I just mentioned, we see here the leader of the Surrealists, André Breton, who of course represented the chaos of the subconscious. Next to him is a representative of the order of the grid painting we just saw, Piet Mondrian. Now, have you ever seen the face of somebody more uncomfortable in the company of anybody, but especially in rubbing shoulders with the man who represented chaos rather than order? Can you see the red dot? This is Mondrian. Okay, I hope never to see that expression with people I'm with. Okay. Of the work exhibited at that gallery, Art of the Century, roughly half was abstract and roughly half was surrealist. Peggy Guggenheim herself described the jewelry she wore to the opening, quote, I wore one of my Tanguy earrings. Tanguy is a surrealist painter, and one made by Calder, an abstract artist, in order to show my impartiality between surrealist and abstract art, end quote. So it's really no mystery, this development of the style practiced by Motherwell and Newman and Pollack and Frankenthaler, a style whose roots were clearly those of Cubist abstraction combined with surrealism. The style that eventually became known by several names: the New York School, action painting, and the one most commonly used today, abstract expressionism. It is no accident that in the following years, Guggenheim began to show the work of these painters, which also included Mark Rothko and Clifford Still. Of this group of rising stars, the fastest rising was Jackson Pollock. As Guggenheim herself said, quote, Pollock became the star of the gallery. And for 5 years, I supported him and launched him by selling his paintings, end quote. During this period of his rise to stardom, Pollock made several interesting observations. The creation of an American style, he said, did not interest him. What did interest him was the work of the European surrealists in New York at the time. What did particularly interest him, he said, was the European artists' quote, concept of the source of art being the unconscious. Let me repeat that. The concept of the source of art being the unconscious. Now, I'll return to this idea of the interest in the unconscious, but also want to add at this point that Robert Motherwell, whom I quoted earlier, also said at this time, quote, in the greatest painting, the painter communes with himself, end quote. Meaning that painting will be the place where psychic therapy will take place, where the mind will divulge its secrets. It's very important to mention this retreat into the unconscious and into communing with oneself at this time in American society, because there was a growing trend in the national consciousness that any form of modern art, especially abstract art, was unpatriotic, un-American. Modern and abstract art were attacked publicly in the US Congress in 1949 by a congressman who stood up in Congress and said the following, quote, all of these isms are of foreign origin and truly have no place in American art. All are instruments and weapons of destruction. Who has brought down this curse upon us? Who has led into our homeland this horde of germ-carrying art vermin? A subversive doctrine of isms, communist-inspired and communist-connected, end quote. 2 years before that statement, in 1947, Robert Motherwell had already posed a solution to this political threat. He already felt it 2 years earlier. This is what he said, quote, if one is to continue to paint or write as the political trap seems to close upon him, he must perhaps have the extremist faith. In his extremism, he shows that he has recognized how drastic the political presence is, end quote. Motherwell's message seems to be that if the political heat is too hot, the artist must take extreme measures for protection, but as an artist, with his art. This is a retreat from the politics of threat, from an oppressive world. Where else to go but to the hidden unconscious, for relief, for protection. It is in the year of Motherwell's statement, in 1947, that Pollack paints his first completely abstract painting. We see him here in the act of painting. It's also the year that he makes a very important statement. It's a long quotation, so please bear with me as I read it. Quote, my painting does not come from the easel. I hardly ever stretch my canvas before painting. And by stretching, he means attaching the canvas tightly over a wooden frame. I prefer to tack the unstretched canvas to the hard wall or the floor. I need the resistance of a hard surface. On the floor, I am more at ease. I feel near, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and literally be in the painting. When I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. It is only after a sort of getting acquainted period that I see what I have been about. I have no fears about making changes, destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well. End quote. This is such an important statement of purposes and so radical in its implications compared to all previous art making that I want to read it again, asking you to pay special attention to how Pollack invests painting with the idea of process, of a process depending so very much on two things: the movement of the body, especially the movement of the body inside of the painting, and the importance of the unconscious mind, of not being consciously aware of what is happening. These 2 points of the body in motion and of the mind in a state of suspended animation make up a theory of art making that is profoundly new and challenges every sacred assumption held about creativity up until this point in history. While I'm rereading the statement, look also carefully at photographs taken of Pollack in the act of painting. So apart from this one, I'm going to show you a few others while I reread that statement. Again, my painting does not come from the easel. I hardly ever stretch my canvas before painting. I prefer to tack the unstretched canvas to the hard wall or the floor. I need the resistance of a hard surface. On the floor, I am more at ease. I feel near, more a part of the painting, since this way I can walk around it, work from the four sides, and literally be in the painting. When I'm in my painting, I'm not aware of what I'm doing. It is only after a sort of getting acquainted period that I see what I have been about. I have no fears about making changes, destroying the image, etc., because the painting has a life of its own. I try to let it come through. It is only when I lose contact with the painting that the result is a mess. Otherwise, there is pure harmony, an easy give and take, and the painting comes out well. That's the end of the quote again. This explains why the paint has to be dripped, splashed, and splattered rather than applied with a brush. A brush controls paint, but paint as unconscious cannot be controlled, and unconsciousness is by definition uncontrollable. Therefore, as the drops of paint leave the dripping brush and free fall onto the canvas, that second or two where they are falling through space is when and where they assume their own uncontrolled reality, their own empowerment as the free-form manifestations of the artist's unconscious dripping onto the canvas. And once on the canvas, become the abstract representations of his psychic interior. No wonder that a certain form of psychoanalysis still uses ink blots to uncover our unconscious mind. The abstract ink blot has to be abstract to access the deep recesses of our psyche. A realistic image will not work in that regard. The drip paintings of Pollack are gigantic ink blot images. Now, this painting always causes me to chuckle because here we have the master realist Norman Rockwell practicing how to do a drip painting by Pollack. So he's trying to capture the abstract quality of those drips as realistically as possible. And that paradox is inescapable and always causes me to chuckle. Okay. Which means that we have arrived at an unexpected and curious paradox. The paradox is that with this sort of reading I am proposing, these so-called abstract paintings are not abstract at all, but quite representational. They are making a claim that this indeed is what the insides of our unconscious mind looks like. And who can argue with that? Who can say that they are wrong in that claim or that the mind looks differently than this? Of course we can't. And of course these paintings can defend their claim because there's nothing to disprove it. Could it be that we are looking at an art that is as fully representational as that of Norman Rockwell? That it is simply a representation of something we have never seen, something so foreign that it cannot be captured by a brush carefully delineating its contours, that can only be represented by drops of paint flying through the air and landing in chaotic splats in dripping lines. So far, we've been discussing how it is possible to read these paintings as very meaningful. The meanings depending on a strong understanding of context, either that of the artist's biography or of the historical period in which they were made. I would like now to suggest a way of reading meaning out of these paintings through a non-academic manner, through a more spontaneous and intuitive manner. After all, this is how most people will encounter them, not through research, but through an in-person encounter at a museum. Let's take a while to look carefully at a fully realized web or drip painting, as these were usually called. This is titled Arabesque. We saw it earlier, which apparently at one time hung over the sofa at the Pollack household. But first, we have to pause, as there was no best way to start looking and thinking. There was no story, no figure, no space, no sense of orientation. But all of those negatives work to deliver a positive space of contemplation of immense proportions. During this pause, we are allowing ourselves to let go of rules and conventions, of limitations, of useless conceptual boxes. We realize soon enough that we are not looking through a figure to a story, not through a space to a distant mountain, not through a metaphor to a moral conclusion. Once we realize that we are not using the painting as a vehicle to get to something else, the concept of through becomes irrelevant. At that point, there is immediately the realization, and a powerful one at that, and that is that we are now looking at something, some material fact of its presence that refuses to be anything but itself. This is a philosophy about truth. This is how it works. When something stops standing in for something else, it becomes its own self, with such objective, perhaps brutal honesty that it can transfix our consciousness. A drip line of pigment is ultimately a drip line of pigment. It asserts its unique, original, and untainted, unqualified presence. It is completely free, owing nothing to its surroundings, nothing even to its human viewer, standing on the ground. Thank you for emphasizing that point. It's uncanny, the timing of those dings. I appreciate it more than you know. Even to its human viewer standing on the ground, that viewer ruled by gravity and the sensations of her or his body. We, the viewers, can no longer control this image. It exists on its own terms. But the knife cuts both ways. As the painting disengages from our authority, so do we disengage from it. When this happens, when we no longer see our world through other objects such as representational paintings, we fall back on our own identities. Without conceptual crutches, we now process everything internally through our deep psyche and imperfect morality, our daunting and perhaps terrifying responsibility to ourselves. We now become more aware, more critical, more complex, more fulfilled, and for better or worse, more ourselves. Now that we've gone deeply into reading a typical drip painting by Pollack, I want to introduce a new idea for understanding these paintings. An idea suggested by Pollack himself. He wrote, quote, "It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, and the old forms of the Renaissance or of any past culture." I'm going to repeat that. It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express this age, the airplane, the atom bomb, the radio, in the old forms of the Renaissance or any past culture. This most provocative statement claims a huge difference in the quality of life in the modern period, especially post-World War II, as compared to pre-modern times. Let's consider the terms he names as central to this difference. The airplane. Even though the aerodynamics of flight are rather objective and comprehensible, many of us still today look up at a 747 floating above us and wonder, how is that all possible? It seems like an act of magic, perhaps unexplainable. The atom bomb, by destroying the objective and material world to smithereens, by reducing cities and people to so much radioactive dust, raised serious doubts about the stability and longevity of solid materials and of the human race. And the radio, with its wireless communication that passes through walls, seemed another aspect of abstract magic. Put these three together and you have a world made up of powerful, incomprehensible, and abstract entities, some very helpful in increasing the quality of our lives, some threatening the existence of that very life. So to recall parts of the quote, if the old forms of the Renaissance cannot express this age, then what can? The answer here seems to be that only abstract art can capture the uncertainty, instability, and unease of a consciousness that sees the world as basically unknowable and incomprehensible in realistic terms. The only possible terms of address are perhaps philosophical and psychological qualities of life that are highly abstract and non-objective. And the only way to make these qualities visible is through abstraction in art. Pollack had set such serious goals for these paintings, to come to terms with an indescribable world, to represent the daunting contents of his psychic interior, to represent that it put tremendous pressures on him to maintain this level of uncompromising abstraction. No wonder that this period of high abstraction lasted only about 3 years for Pollack. We know that it caused him tremendous agitation and insecurity. We also know that he struggled to get out of this phase, that he worked hard to bring the human figure and representation back into his art. But how does one do that when the recognizable world has been so completely compromised? Well, it happens slowly and with great difficulty. In this painting, he placed his own handprints in paint in the top margin. See them right here? You see the hand and the fingers. In the top margin, in order to reassert his own bodily presence. And this is a detail. Here you can see the handprints at the top. But see how the hands are forced to the margins, seemingly reaching to get over this impenetrable wall of the web. This painting, titled significantly Out of the Web, we can see human-like figures that seem to struggle to free themselves from the web, almost as if the conscious mind, now represented in some coherent form, has to reemerge to claim or to reclaim its former place in human consciousness. Here, in a painting called Cutout, where he actually cut a human shape into the canvas of a drip painting, I would suggest that the act of cutting is deliberate to the point of desperation. It is almost as if he is admitting that the abstract and the figurative cannot interact or coexist. One has to deny or violate the other, or exist in a totally different dimension, as in this painting, where he has detached his face from the web, expressing their need for separation, but also because they are on the same canvas. One can never truly escape the other. The conscious mind can never free itself from the chaos of the unconscious. I want to end my presentation today by bringing the paintings back into a historical context, back to the period of the early 1950s, the early Cold War. Remember that the last time I mentioned politics, it was in terms of the congressman who in 1949 was warning his fellow communist-fearing Americans about the evils of modern art. Interestingly, that opinion made a sudden turnabout in the early 1950s in abstract expressionism by people like Pollack or by Lee Krasner, but especially by Pollack, began to be seen as the perfect cultural ambassadors on the world stage that spoke about the virtues of American values, as opposed to the evils of the values of the communist bloc countries, especially, of course, of the then Soviet Union, the other major nuclear superpower and the main ideological enemy of the United States. So how did this happen? The United States saw itself as opposed to the Soviet Union in every possible way. All foreign policy was based on the premise that, quote, the Russians are coming, and that when they arrived and took over the United States, we would use all of our political freedoms and live under a total and brutal dictatorship. Our nuclear armament and our good guy status was all that stood between a free world and the world overrun by the Russian bear, gobbling up weaker countries to feed his voracious appetite for power and world domination. Let me just pause and tell you that I first prepared this lecture 3 years ago, before it was canceled by COVID. And it never struck me at that point that what I just read to you would be so resonant with us today. And it just makes me catch my breath, the irony of that. I didn't want to let that go by without emphasizing. And I didn't want to correct that. I wanted to be true to the original intention and for us to be aware of everything that is happening. Thank you for that interlude. The salvation of the world was up to the United States in every possible angle. To impose American superiority over Russian evil was used. Now, the lurid and melodramatic terms I have just used to describe the state of affairs might seem overstated to those of you who did not live through that time in history. But to those of you who did, I am certain that they seem very familiar indeed. The terms of opposition were the following. The Soviets controlled their people completely with strict and ruthless authority. There was no freedom of mind or body. You did what you were told, or else you were imprisoned or never seen again. On the contrary, the opposing myth was that in America, all citizens enjoyed complete freedom of choice and movement, that it was the shining example of liberalism where the human spirit was encouraged to expand without restrictions or limitations, where you could allow your imagination free rein without the fear of a controlling authority. These values had to be exported, had to be expressed in parts of the world, such as Europe, where the contest between East and West was felt most keenly as European nations saw themselves as the battleground for the two great superpowers if the next war was to be fought with conventional weapons. An article in the New York Times Magazine of April 1948 was entitled, "We Can Win the Battle for the Mind of Europe. The Europeans behind the Iron Curtain can still be swung to Western culture." And an important quote from this article, which supports my thesis, is, quote, "Cultural freedom and the freedom of the individual are among the realest issues in Europe today," end quote. Some visible form of this myth of American liberalism was urgently required at this time, And paradoxically, in the face of recent political opposition to it, it turned out to be abstract paintings of Pollack and his circle. Why? Look carefully at the drip paintings of these years, 47 to 50, and see how the ideology of American freedom is articulated here. In a completely abstract painting, there are no imposed meanings and no authoritative interpretations. The value being expressed is that of complete freedom, of the right of the spirit to expand to infinite horizons of expression, with no big brother or thought police to tell you what is allowed and not allowed. This is American art, made in America, where you have fought for these political and cultural freedoms across Europe and Africa and the Pacific. And no one is going to take that away from you. A recent book on abstract expressionism puts the issue this way, quote, abstract artists articulated in their works values that were assimilated by politicians, with the result that artistic rebellion was transformed into aggressive liberal ideology. The new painting was made into the image of the new America, powerful and internationalist, but anxious about the communist threat. How can anyone resist the heady rush of liberating energies exploding off of these canvases? The US State Department saw all of these qualities in these paintings and sent them on touring exhibits overseas as the main exponent of high culture in the symbolic but important skirmishes of the Cold War. It was especially relevant that the official painting of the Soviet Union at this time was not done in an abstract style, not at all, but rather in a highly polished form of realism, known as social realism. So not only did abstract expressionism have inherent qualities of American values, but how convenient that the Soviet Union had an entirely different style. How very convenient that the oppositions in political ideologies between the two superpowers were perfectly echoed by the very opposite cultures represented by these diametrically opposed painting styles. It turns out that these American paintings had a real meaning and a practical use in the end, not on the walls of affluent collectors, but in the strategy books of the real connoisseurs of abstract expressionism, the bureaucrats of the State Department. It is important to end this lecture on this note of historical context, because it proves how powerful these images were in dangerous times of the near past. And I stress near past, as we have inherited many of the problems of the Cold War, some of which may heat up suddenly with the slightest provocation. We need to look at these paintings not only as powerful aesthetic experiences, which they can be, not only as radical experiments in visual expression, not only as tortured confessions of the dangerous unconscious, and not only as vehicles of political propaganda, but certainly as all of these possibilities. What I ask you not to do is to close off the historical period in which they were painted as a moment long past, safe in the distance of time. In so many ways, that time is still this time. And these paintings hold powerful lessons for us, lessons that we may ignore at our peril. Remember how we started this talk with a list of questions that people typically and dismissively apply to abstract art. I hope that by now none of you have to ask yourselves those questions. Let me presume to suggest that you can now ask a new and different set of questions, such as, what sort of complicated set of issues drove Pollack to paint this way? What was the world like at that time to make this sort of painting possible? What job was this sort of art supposed to accomplish? Was it personal or political or both? What is my relationship to it, my responsibility to this sort of art? And finally, how can I apply the lessons I've learned in front of this art to other kinds of art, perhaps equally challenging and daunting at first encounter? When you walk through the halls of the Met with these images on exhibit, take in the full visual impact of these paintings, and at the same time breathe in the spirit of the time in which these paintings were made. Reflect on how much and how little the world has changed since then. And you will understand these challenging paintings much better than any lecture can possibly explain. I want to end with a quotation that I heard maybe a couple of months ago on NPR, where a man named Patrick Bringley was interviewed. Patrick Bringley served 10 years as a guard at the Met. And he wrote a book on his experience called All the Beauty in the World. Here's a quotation that really stuck with me that I think sums up my lecture. He said, "Learn from art, not just learning about the arts." Thank you. Thank you for that generous reaction. I feel like I'm on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera or something. Not in costume, but I'm very happy to take any of all questions. One thing I've learned about Vanderbilt students is two things. You're very smart and you're not shy. So here's a hand if that person could get the microphone, please.
I just wanted to share a thought and get your reaction to it.
Okay.
I love Pollack's paintings. Going to see them here at the museum, it feels like you're stepping into a creative blizzard of someone's thoughts, emotions, experiences. Is almost three-dimensional, like it's swirling around you. But during the last visit, I also saw a massive painting that was completely blank except for one red stripe down the side. And I had never gotten so enraged by a painting. I felt like it was, sort of a childish work that was intended to dupe rich people into thinking that it had some kind of profound meaning, while at the same time hogging space that could have been used by people like Da Vinci or others to really share something creative and meaningful.
I'm so glad you said that. Because it's so typical of what many people feel in front of such paintings as you describe. First of all, I should say that Da Vinci and Michelangelo had their time. And the reason that we value them is because they were so representative of their time. We can soak in their history through that wonderful window that they give us. Contemporary times are very different for reasons I've tried to suggest today, but in terms of the kind of painting you just suggested, mostly blank white with a red stripe, right? The fact that it got under your skin, the fact that it angered you, put you into a very active relationship to it. Apparently you didn't walk by it, and it stayed with you to the point that you wanted to share it with us today, which deeply impresses me. Right? Another A for the day to you. But to be totally serious, that painting was not possible in the times of the Renaissance or the 18th century or even the 19th century. It is unique to our time, and we need to own up to the fact that somebody did that in our time. So the question is why? Many people ask the question, there's even a more extreme form that the American abstract painter Robert Ryman paints completely white paintings without the benefit of the red stripe, right? Completely white. And people say, how is that different from a wall painting? On the one hand, it's not, but on the other hand, it's made you think about painted walls, which is part of architecture, which is part of the space that encloses us physically and socially. All of a sudden, we have to decide what is art. When you walk into the Sistine Chapel and look up at Michelangelo's painted ceiling, nobody in this room, including myself, ever looks up at the ceiling and says, wow, I wonder if that's art, right? But we do in front of the paintings that you suggested, even the white painting of Robert Ryman. The fact that it's forced us into that uncomfortable situation benefits us, because what I love about teaching in the humanities and abstract art is the tools of critical analysis and deep thinking that you've gone through don't have to stay with that painting or that museum. You can go out into the world and apply it to politics, to personal relationships, to the environment. And how great that that abstract painting triggered that, I don't know, that kind of frustration in you that will ultimately lead to a positive place for you. I really think that. So thank you so much for sharing that. Other comments or questions?
In this Cold War kind of battle of the styles between the two nations, where do you fit in Russian abstract artists like Kandinsky that really paved the way for Pollack?
Yes. People like Kandinsky, I think it's a name that might be familiar to many of you, and other abstract Russian artists like Malevich, Lisitsky, Goncharova, and so forth. Some of these artists started in a very special period of the history of the Soviet Union, what we now used to call Russia, now call Russia again. This was the few years after the revolution of 1917, where there was a space of open experimentation in culture. Lenin himself said, we will destroy everything, which meant not only socially and politically, but the artists took that to be stylistically as well. When Lenin died, there was a new regime that took over, the Stalinist regime. Stalin put a clamp on artistic experimentation, including Kandinsky. Kandinsky had to leave Russia, and he developed most of his career in Germany and taught in the Bauhaus, for instance. So with the political climate changing in Russia, with the advent of Stalin, which was really a new form of the Tsar, Stalin needed realistic art to impose his propaganda, his ideology. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was a window of opportunity that came and went in a blink of an eye, left really provocative, interesting abstract art, but was forced out by politics. These are great questions. I'm gonna remember this for a long time. Yes.
In the beginning of your talk, you mentioned, I think, Robert Motherwell saying that artists had to kind of turn away from the world. And at the end, you said that paintings were going out into the world as kind of American propaganda. Did these artists have any feelings about that?
Yes, they did. Pollack was very uncomfortable with his paintings being used for political propaganda. He never intended that in the first place. As a matter of fact, many of the titles we have of Pollack's paintings that are very resonant with some kind of meaning, like autumn rhythm or convergence, he didn't give those titles to his paintings. His critic friends or his art gallery agents gave those titles. So we can never read through the title to the meaning of the Pollack paintings. So he himself never saw any political purpose or impulse. And he was uncomfortable with that. Motherwell was also uncomfortable. Motherwell was a very radical guy. He hated the idea of selling out to the man, right? He wanted nothing to do with it. But I made a joke about the US State Department bureaucrats. They knew what they were doing. They said, hey, we don't know what this painting means. We might not even like it. But guess what? It's the opposite of what the Russians are doing. It's the opposite, so we have to use it. It went on several tours overseas, especially in Europe, where we had to win the hearts and minds of people who were making choices between East and West. So thank you.
Just a quick follow-up. Was it effective?
There is no conclusive answer to that. There were no, as far as I understand, no follow-up study or polls taken of its effectiveness. Apparently, the State Department felt it was effective enough to go through it without measuring the results politically. I know of no way to measure the effectiveness in the long run, but the doing of it was seen as very valuable to make the gesture. I think there was a hand over there somewhere. Yes.
You mentioned Lee Krasner. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you think their artistic processes played off of one another, and if you think, obviously, the female Abex artists are sort of having a bit of a renaissance. right now, and if you think they will ever sort of have the acclaim and maybe achieve the prices that the male Apex artists do.
Okay. I would like them to achieve the status. The prices, you never can tell. The art market is so whimsical. But I would say that if you take a feminist approach to, as you nicknamed it correctly, AbX, abstract expressionism, it's no doubt that people like Pollack and Newman and Rothko saw this as a very macho art, a very testosterone-driven style. And we can go into some erotic interpretation of the paint dripping off the paintbrush if you want to, but I think you can see my point. Female artists of the time, especially ones you mentioned, found it difficult to enter into that dialogue, into that discourse, and were definitely marginalized, and definitely they're coming to our attention now by very ambitious art historians. It's way overdue. Yes, I agree. And very, very welcome. Boy, these alums are getting younger all the time. Huh? So I agree completely with your reason for bringing up the question, and I applaud it very much. These artists need more exhibits, more attention, more scholarship, and museums will respond to that only if you guys express that, right? Yes.
This is somewhat a piggyback to the question he asked about the impact of the authoritarianism
Yes.
on abstract expressionism. I would wonder what you think about the efforts these days to cancel culture and to remove a lot of the catalysts that we would have as a people to think independently and review things of this nature and what the impact of art will be on that.
Well, what I think about that issue, which is super important, especially in areas south of us right now, especially in Florida. Let's be very honest about what's happening there with restrictions in books and libraries. Once people start determining what is appropriate or inappropriate, then it opens a floodgate, right? Like, what is next after that? I think we have to think historically about the slippery slope of canceling anything on either side of the political divide. Because once that starts happening, then you start silencing people, you start silencing genders. Certain races get silenced, certain social classes get silenced. And then people seem to forget the historical lesson of times in the 20th century where massive populations were silenced and imprisoned and worse. So yes, I'm very worried about that. One of the reasons I believe in lecturing on this material is because I think thinking about this kind of art operates as a lever to open up possibilities rather than close them. So yes, thank you for asking that question. That's super important.
Toward the beginning, you showed the image, and no pun intended, where you painted the picture of him with his paintbrush, and you talked about once the paint leaves the paintbrush, it's very free, and you talk about the unknown and the unconscious and the What Jackson Pollack has created is something so known, so we now all walk into these big museums and we see a Pollack and we walk in and we say, oh, that's a Pollack, and then we move on. Is this a compliment to him, or would he just be rolling his eyes as now we're like, he did all this work and we're like, that's a Pollack?
It is definitely not a compliment. People do the same thing to Mondrian. There was once a study where somebody in a major museum had a stopwatch and measured how much time and how little time people spend in front of different kinds of paintings. Mondrian got the least amount of time. Like a split second, people look and say, oh, not interested, another Mondrian. No, not a compliment at all. Because what these artists did, I mean, if this were a talk about Mondrian, and some of you have heard my Mondrian lecture, it's deserving of such deep analysis, and it's so meaningful, and they put so much of their heart and souls into these that no, I would like everybody to look at everything with equal attention. As a matter of fact, looking at abstract art of either Pollack or Mondrian critically and analytically will allow you to go back to the Da Vinci's and the Rockwells. I walked through the galleries of Egyptian art today. It'll allow you to jump back through thousands of years of human creativity and say, it is from this point of view now in the 21st century that I can understand with greater clarity, with greater appreciation of everything that brought us to this point. It has to be done. That's the difficult intellectual work and political work that we need to do to move forward as a society. I've always been impressed by Vanderbilt students because you always give me a sense that in many different times of our history, maybe now, when things seem super challenging and it can wear us down, you've always given me a sign of hope for the future. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that. Was there another question? Yes.
With reference to today's topic, can you speak to any similarities or differences with the architectural movements that were taking place during this time?
Yes. As some of you know, I teach a class also in the history of modern architecture. And in the 1950s, what was happening, especially in the Western world, which is where my expertise is, Europe and the United States, there was this, how should I say, this acceptance and proliferation of what's called the international style. The international style is best characterized by what we call the steel and glass skyscraper. And of course, in this city, you have no lack of such examples. And the reason it became so prevalent and so dominant during that time, thank you for that question, is because America and Western Europe became very corporate in its structure and its ideology. It's no surprise that these tall steel and glass skyscrapers were commissioned by corporations, not by individuals. They're not houses, although at this time some of that style is designed for condominiums and such, but were originally designed to represent the American fortitude and strength of corporate America. So they looked strong, they looked masculine, they looked trustworthy, that they would stand forever. So you could trust your business with them. You could trust the money that you spent with them. I would say the proliferation of that style was happening at this time. And in some ways, thank you, Sarah, for asking that question, because it strikes me that the purity of the geometric forms that were used in that architectural style and the purity of the materials, just steel and just glass, is not too far away from the statement of the purity of material and medium in these paintings as well. Yes, thank you. By the way, the exception to that in the 50s was, of course, our friend who designed the museum across the street, the Guggenheim. And I actually, when I came here this morning, I had the taxi drop me off at the Guggenheim first. I had to look at it before walking here. It just does things to you that are very necessary. I think I'm getting an idea that we can only take one more. Okay.
You've given me a lot to think about. Oh, sorry. Everyone
Good.
can always hear me. You've given me a lot to think about with looking at the Pollacks and everything. And I believe it was like your second slide, Autumn Dreams, and then later on, Arabesque. And to me, the color palettes are very similar. As you said, the paint chose to flow off the brush similarly to both. But Autumn Dreams had a white background and Arabesque had a brown background.
Mm-hmm.
Can we read something political into that? Or is that just...
No, you can read something into anything. That's the wonderful thing about art and abstract art. I would say that in many cases, Pollack decided to leave the raw canvas unpainted.
Okay.
And that shows through as a brown background once in a while, I think in Autumn Rhythm. And the reason he did that,
Maybe I got them wrong. Yeah.
no, that's okay. The reason he did that is to make us super aware of the medium, that this paint rests on something, and that something has as much materiality and object to it, and standing in for truthfulness about its materiality as the pigment itself. So it was a way to acknowledge that fact of the painted surface, very obviously. There were times when he used aluminum paint, and when you see aluminum paint in some of these paintings, as you walk past in front of them, you uncannily start catching slight reflections of yourself walking in front of it. You don't see yourself clearly because it's distorted, but all of a sudden, your image, distorted, has become implicated into the imagery itself. You are now part of the web, part of the drips, part of the unconscious of the painting. It's pulled you into its world. So I guess color is used very deliberately, sometimes as an unpainted canvas, sometimes as the aluminum paint. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
I think we unfortunately have reached the end of our time. What I want to say to you is two things. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for everything that you've meant to me. You will always remain my students. Even the people who are today here for the first time as my student, always remain my students. And I hope to maybe as we leave into the lobby, maybe catch up with a few of you. But no, this has been a terrific experience for me. Thank you so much.